How's that? Is there an echo now? Is that better? Can you hear me all right? Great. Right, well, today we're going to talk a bit about the city, or really about the place of architecture in the city. And we saw yesterday, or glimpsed, in London and Barcelona and Porto, how the new architecture that's around the world now is part of making a particular kind of city. And I've got serious reservations about that. There are many limitations in that sort of city that have to be addressed. It's unsustainability, it's inequity, it's inconvenience, it's inefficiency, it's very unsustainable in all sorts of ways, it's very unsafe, and it's fragmented. All of those things need to be dealt with, and I can't possibly talk about them today. I'm really just going to talk about one aspect, which is the spatial organization and the loss of quality of the city as a place. I think the least one can expect from a city as a place to inhabit is that it's not hostile and that it goes some way to satisfying human needs. And needs themselves could be the subject of a whole lecture, what the human needs are. I mentioned yesterday Maslow's hierarchical set, which you can see on the left there. I actually prefer the conception of a man called Manfred Max Neef, who was a Chilean economist in the 1980s, was asked by the United Nations to tell them why aid was so ineffective. And when he looked at it, he recognized that it was all focused on one factor, that was the economic factor, the level of GDP. And because it was so singularly directed, all sorts of other needs were interfered with. So rather than aid being a help, it was the opposite of that. So he started to look for, or he proposed that there should be approaching development in a much broader way with a wide scale of needs. And so he developed what you can see on the right-hand side, 9 basic needs as he saw them, and he found all kinds of ways in which, with different kind of what he called satisfiers, you could create synergies amongst these needs that would be very effective in human development. So it was very much aimed at human development. Now, I'd love to be able to approach a city with an idea like that and analyze it, but it's obviously going to be a very complex matrix of things, so I'm really going to use them very loosely and merely to provide a kind of framework for imagining whether a city or a piece of city helps satisfy needs. One can't ever imagine that the spatial organization of a city will satisfy needs. It's whether it helps it or enables it or not. So one must always bear that in mind. So it's really looking at pieces of city to get some sense of whether they are being useful and helpful in satisfying ordinary human needs, which you can see there, and we'll perhaps get a bit more of an idea of what those are about as we go on. There are many, many examples of what I see and have seen as that seem to be good places for human beings to live in, that seem to satisfy those needs in some ways, and that they're mainly in old cities and a few in modern ones, and pieces in them where their spatial organization assists a broad satisfaction of having a good life. So I'm going to begin in Padua. In the center of Padua, around this Palazzo dei Signori, there are these 3 squares, piazzas, the Piazza dell'Erba, della Frutta, and dei Signori, clustered around the space. And if you go to Piazza dei Signori early in the morning, that's what it looks like. And I think one can immediately sense its sense of order and completeness and enclosure, that it's the kind of space and the scale of space that you could remember that you could feel comfortable in, with its very old clock tower and its buildings of a reasonable kind of height around, and a floor that looks a habitable kind of floor for people to be in. Not very much later, by the time people are scurrying off to work, it's full of a market where these vehicles come in, pull out cantilevered hoods, pull out all their wares, many, many different kinds of ones, and set up a market. So as you're going off to work in the morning, this is what you're confronted with. And on the other side of that big Palazzo dei Signori, there's another square that's getting going, and it's set up a whole market of fresh produce. It's amazing, actually, that after all these years, it's still the fresh produce market. The Piazza dell'Erba, the name is probably from the Middle Ages, but so it's still fulfilling that same usefulness in the city of making a fruit and veg market. And if you think of that in terms of Max Neef's ideas, one can visualize a whole group, a large number of small businesses being able to set up there and earn a living there. So in a certain sense, it's providing that, or it's helping, it's enabling that idea of subsistence to flourish. While that's all going on, all these little cafes around the square and in the edges of the around the edges of the Palazzo dei Signori, all these little cafes, coffee places, and so on are opening up. So there are people, school children going off to work, going off to school, office workers going off to work, mothers taking children to creches, businessmen going off to their professions. And they all walk through these places and they meet other people. And you can see them there, all chatting away, having a cup of coffee on the way to whatever they're going to do. Around breakfast time, a lot of them, in fact, have breakfast in those little places. So it's very, very easily, it's a very easy place to make contact. There's a fantastic possibility of face-to-face contact between ordinary citizens. And I think that you can see that starting to fulfill the ideas of Max Neef of participation in things that are going on around you, and of affection, that there's opportunities for people to meet each other and pass the time of day in one way or another. It doesn't happen in Athlone. After the early morning rush, the profile of people coming into the square starts to change, and you get a lot of young people, particularly women and children. And I'm cheating a little bit here because this, in fact, is not in Padua, it's in Mantua. But you can see that in this kind of space, with the kind of buildings that are around it, which are of a height that it's well overlooked, where there's a lot of activity going on in the streets, you're very protected by the space. The space enables safety, human safety. Everything is watched over and looked at and protected. And you don't get any prize for telling me that it doesn't work in the same way in streets like that, in Fischhoek or other parts of Cape Town. At lunchtime, and this is actually not taken on the same day as the previous photographs of the square, but in fact, those markets do clear out of those squares extraordinarily quickly, and at lunchtime you often do get a crowd approaching this sort of size crowd. So lots and lots of people come out, and they use the square as a dining room. you can see literally thousands of people, and they're not tourists, or there obviously are tourists there, but Padua, in fact, is not a very tourist-laden city. Hundreds and hundreds of people go to the square for lunch. So you can see the idea that's developing is that it's actually a living room. The square is a living room. It's where people spend their lives. It's actually part of their home. So there's a political party that comes out at lunchtime to catch the big crowd, and they make a presentation related to their candidate, and you can participate politically merely by passing by on your bicycle and stopping and listening into what she's got to say. I think it was a female candidate that they were talking about, that was being presented there. Meanwhile, the day is drawing on, and these are actually all from the same day. And on the other square, the Piazza del Frutta, from where the market has now disappeared, there's another exhibition that, there's something else that starts to go on, and there's a group of people come out, and you find that they all belong to a little society of people interested in old cultural machines and things, and they set up all their exhibits, and there's a cultural exhibition in the evening. Now we've gone back to the Piazza dei Signori again, and you can see the evening is starting, and people are coming out, friends, families, lovers. The restaurateurs have spread out onto the floor of the place, and people are sitting down, and they're quietly spending the end of the day relaxing. So those ideas of idleness and recreation and so on of Max Neef's, you can see how easily the square operates for that. And then again, if one imagines going to a place like this a number of times, how quickly it becomes part of you. You become familiar with it and develop an affection for the place, and part of your own identity gets associated with the square. In fact, it was quite interesting that we only spent about 4 or 5 days close to this. After 3 days, I was recognized when I walked through the square, and people said, "Oh, hi," and they wanted to speak to me about the day before. So it's incredibly familiar as a place to live. If you sit where we were sitting over there, and you watch what's going on the other side of that same square, they're starting to set up, you can see a lot of lights and a public address system, and in the evening, around about 8 o'clock or something like that, there's a pageant. And they come out, and there's a fantastic enactment going on of, I don't know whether she's Joan of Arc or quite who she was. We couldn't understand. But there's a whole crowd of people clustered around this, children on their father's shoulders, and people jostling around, walking to and fro. And in amongst everybody walking to and fro, there are all these young people on stilts who are wandering around, who are presumably connected in some way with this pageant that was going on. And when that's all finished, people stay there. And it's now getting quite late in the evening, and they're still there eating away, chatting away, and a couple of friends talking over a bicycle and so on. So you can see that it's actually their home. It's where they live. It's where people in Padua spend their lives. It's the city as home. So, I mean, if I look at a place like this, I think it goes a long way towards fulfilling a lot of those needs and making a place of the good life. And it's not just wealthy people who could enjoy a place like this. Anybody can. It doesn't matter. You don't need to earn money. You don't need to be well off to be able to enjoy this. In fact, in many ways, it's sort of made for poorer people, because you live in a small apartment somewhere, and yet you've still got this absolutely glorious set of living rooms that you can spend your life in. So I've spoken quite a lot about how the space performs, so I think now we should look at how it's actually made. So I'm going to jump from Padua to another part of the world, Cáceres, which is in Spain. It's a little medieval town in Spain. And here's another a typical square. And if one just looks at how it's actually made, firstly, it takes up the land very sensitively, doesn't it? It's not imposing on the land. It's picking up the levels. It's making divisions in the level of the land. You can see on the right-hand side how it steps up, so you get a slightly more prominent area where you've got restaurants, and it opens to an old church building. So it's very sensitive to the site that it's on. It's made of a whole series of buildings that are almost the same. All down the left-hand side and straight in front of us, the buildings are more or less the same. They're all 4 stories high, and they're anonymous buildings. But they're slightly different. There's a whole a space between those buildings and the square. Again, that sort of little intertidal zone between the inside of the building and out, where there's something that's going on. And you can see there's a whole lot of restaurants that are using that space. There are some buildings that are more prominent. So on the right-hand side, there's an old tower. So that obviously that with the because that helps to give this a bit more individuality as a space, something that you could remember more clearly. See if there's anything else I wanted to say about it. I think it's important to say that the buildings are sort of background buildings. None of them is in any way trying to push itself forwards in any kind of a way. They each have a bit of identity, but not very much different from the one next door. Oops. If we step into Barcelona, slightly a street where there's obviously been a bit more money and so on put into it, the same kind of things are happening. And by the way, just look at all the activity that's going on in that street. There's a car, there's a bunch of bicycles there with people meeting on bicycles, and all sorts of things going on, of people going to and fro in the street. So the street's really a social space. We call it a street, but it's actually it's got the same quality as the square, and in the same way, it's got a range of buildings along the side of it that are almost all of the same type. They have similar kinds of relationships with the space outside. They're roughly of the same height, and yet each one's got just enough individuality that you can say, well, that's where I live, and mine's the one with that curvy bit on the top. So there's some differentiation from the one to the other, but not so much that it breaks the wall of buildings. Nothing really jumps out of line, and the place as a whole has got a sort of feeling of closure. So even though it's a street going somewhere, it's also got a sense of identity as a place to be in. If one goes through other parts of Barcelona, you find that square that we started with is part of a whole hierarchy of places, and they're all they've all got these same sort of qualities. So, for instance, on the photograph on the left, you can see there are these places to sit, and there are places of shelter on the right-hand side, also in doorways, and there are trees that give you shelter. And on the bottom right-hand side, there's a sloping surface that gives you a whole lot of spaces to sit. And so there's a whole range of different kinds of things that can go on in these spaces at any time of day or night. And they're all made with these basically 4 to 6 story buildings that are forming very clear and distinctive spaces. Sometimes they're designed by one designer, like this one. It's also in the old Barcelona. But the design is pretty well kept to the rules. It's kept the right sort of height. It's got a vertical division of the building all the way around. There are lots of entrances that go in and out of the buildings. The height's the same. There are places, again, where you can sit and chat and meet your friends. And some of the spaces are parks. They're green spaces. This one actually happens to be in Moscow. This is at about 11 o'clock on a midsummer's night. Okay, so generally we have a picture of a city being made up of a series of outside rooms made with walls of rather background buildings. Of course, there are also major spaces, and there are major buildings usually associated with those major spaces, and big things happen there, like this delightful chap who's got everybody's attention in front of the cathedral. And these major places with these foreground buildings, like the cathedral, help you find your way around. So once you've walked around the set of spaces for really quite a short time, you find you can orientate yourself in space quite easily. And those foreground buildings, although they are different, they're much more developed, they're more elaborate and so on than the other buildings, the ordinary buildings around. They also are part of the same family of buildings. They're not so different that they break that sense of communality of the place as a whole. And if you look at the one in Granada on the right, look how beautifully it mediates in scale, where you get, it's a huge building, but look how there's that lower part where there's a kind of cornice that runs through at the same height as the buildings nearby, that enables you to make a kind of connection between the two. So those buildings are just as much part of making these outside rooms as the background buildings are. The foreground buildings also make sociable spaces. And here's a little family in Seville, having their lunch in one of those spaces. Now, are contemporary cities working in this kind of a way that enable this kind of satisfaction of human needs? And I must say, I don't think there are many parts of them that are. So if you look at a place like that, any guesses for where it is? It's London. So here we are in London, and you can see, looking at that piece of environment, that it couldn't possibly be fulfilling human needs in the same kind of a way as we've been discussing, or enable the good life to happen in the way that we've been discussing. And if you go to Lyon in the middle of France, although I think it's a bit better here, you can still see that the way that it's being organized is not around urban rooms. It's really around buildings. The things that's building that's making the city is the building, not the space. So everybody's making their own building in their own kind of a way, and even though it's a better scale than the one in London, it's a sort of a reasonable height, and there's beautiful water and so on, you can see from that the buildings are not being used to make the spaces. So why is this happening? And this is like a 2-minute introduction to the history of urbanism in the West. But basically, I think there were two main things that happened. And the first was, of the contemporary city, the first thing was that it was a reaction to the horrific industrial city of Europe in the Industrial Revolution, that produced these lines and lines of back-to-back houses with very, very little ventilation, smoke coming out of every chimney in every house because all the heating and everything was done with wood or coal smoke, factories belching out their smoke, and really the most appalling human conditions, urban conditions you can imagine. So there were a whole lot of reactions to that. One of the major ones was Ebenezer Howard's Garden City idea. It's an absolutely brilliant idea if you look at it. The town, all the positive things of the town, and positive and negative things, and all the positive and negative things of the country, and then the town and country coming together where all the negatives are removed and all the positive things come together. So it was like a really brilliant conception of how, as a reaction to that dreaded industrial city, how you make a decent city that combines the advantages of the town and the country. And he devised on the right-hand side, he had this idea of a whole series of small contained cities connected by very rapid movement sitting out there in the country. I mean, it still seems to be like a pretty good idea. So that was the first thing, was the reaction to that industrial city. And the second thing was the motor car. So by 1920 or 25 or something like that, Henry Ford alone was producing 250,000 cars that were coming into the cities. And so when Le Corbusier designed his Plein Voisin in Paris in 1925, he made a city that again was a mixture of the town and the country. So it's basically a whole series of very large buildings that lie in a huge big green park, and it's all organized around a hierarchy of roads. It's a very, very rational response, a very rational plan, hierarchy of roads of different sizes that you use to move into and around the city. You can see it was an imaginary project. You can see the Ile de la Cité on the right-hand side. So he was having a pretty hard go at Paris. Now, both of those ideas, and the Corbusian one, for all its problems, and it certainly got a lot of problems, it was again, I think, a very brilliant response to that to that industrial city, and the suddenly this new thing, the motor car, that was private motor car, that was suddenly there for everybody. Both of these sets of ideas were really taken over by commercialism, and the Ebenezer Howard's Garden City idea was basically turned into suburbia. So it's a whole lot of roads and buildings, separate buildings, separate from each other, isolated in space, and no social space at all. Or this was actually quite a good example of the Corbusian idea in London, Roehampton. But again, you can see that this new kind of city that's being proposed is made up of buildings that are isolated in space. They're not connected to anything. They're not making any kind of space. And whether they're little suburban ones or big high-density ones like this, the thing that's lost in all that is social space. So the very reason that people actually came together to live in cities, for the conviviality and the connection and the face-to-face possibilities that there are in a city, have been destroyed. And so you end up with, you can call it, I've called it a fractured modern city. And there was a planner in the United States in the 1960s who developed this wonderful phrase, I think, that described it so well: a non-place urban realm. Now, if you add to this city globalism, the neoliberal economy, the huge urbanization and migration of people from all over the world of the 21st century, and you've got today's urban crisis. And I've recently spent some time in Japan, and it's just a chaos, the contemporary city. It's spatially completely out of control. How could there have been any kind of control to produce an environment like that? All the traditional ideas about what home is, the idea of the street as a social space, even things like where the center of the city is, what is the center of the city, have all disappeared. There's no city edge any longer. These cities are just crawling over the countryside, gobbling it all up, just like Cape Town threatens to do as it expands. And the countryside is destroyed, and you get this hopeless mixture of people trying to grow things, and factories and warehouses and houses all piled on top of each other. There's no edge to the city at all. And then there's this incredible alienating sameness about the new city. These are all in Osaka. And no urban space at all, really, that's a decent space to live in. And then every city starts to look like everyone else. So, you could just swap any of these: London, Joburg, Tokyo, Atlanta, wherever, Melbourne, wherever you go, the cities get to look more and more the same. And then you get very poor cities. Those are all wealthy cities. When you get poor cities, which is much more looking like what we are starting to look like, where there's much less social control. I mean, in Japan, there's this incredible social control. So there's places, they sort of work because everybody behaves so perfectly. When there's much less of that sort of mores of social control, when there's much more poverty and much more difference between rich and poor, and so on, you get a city like this, and there are many others around the world. Obviously, these are the ones that are actually really growing at the moment at the fastest rate. We're really the only way you can describe it is that they show how amazing human beings are at adapting to really impossible situations, that people find a way of living in these cities reasonably well. And I think, there's a lot of Cape Town that's like this, where you think, well, it just shows what incredible things human beings are, that they can adapt to such a frightful environment and actually come out, doing all sorts of wonderful things out of it. But the actual spatial organization enables nothing of that. It actually works counter to it. So in many ways, these places are extremely hostile to it. And there's no urban space, either there or there, because these isolated buildings don't make up social spaces. So now we must try and find a few places that do it in modern ways, and look at a few pieces of architecture that support the kind of city that's one that's made up of urban spaces, urban rooms, and so on. And I think that parts of Helsinki do that. So there's this band of land in the middle of Helsinki that goes right down to the sea, just like in Cape Town, the band that goes through the gardens down Adderley Street, and it used to go to the sea. It's a very similar thing to that. So at the upper end of it, it's basically a rather narrow park, and lots of people come and have picnics in the park over the weekend. But it's really a band with a path that goes through it, a road on each side, and it runs right down to the water. And on the right-hand side, you can see it going down to the water. Now, if we go to the bottom slide, you can see, you can also pick it up in the top right-hand picture. There's a line of neoclassical buildings that comes down on your left. The water's actually on the right, on your left, and it goes towards this big brickwork church at the end of it, which I think was the Greek Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church at the end. And so the line of buildings comes down very politely, the neoclassical buildings all in a row, and then on the right-hand side of the church there's a new building. Now it's designed by Alvar Aalto, who's the great Finnish architect, and you can imagine what Rem Koolhaas would have done there on that site at the bottom of the street, But look what Aalto did. He kept the same scale as the neoclassical buildings. He's obviously garbed it in a modern way, but it's sustained the quality of that street, and in fact added to it. And then in other parts of Helsinki, if we can stay with the bottom photograph first, because it's just this is the element that runs along the water at 90 degrees to the street that we were just looking at now. If you look at those buildings down there, I mean the one on the right and the next one along, they're pretty ordinary buildings, and they could have been much improved, but they don't destroy the street. They still keep the street. And the way they make contact with the ground and the way they do something else on the top also is reflective of the of the old buildings there. So I mean, I think really all one can say is if the building on the right had a few vertical divisions in it that made it into that showed it in slightly smaller pieces, it would have been fine. But even as it stands there, it's part of that wall of buildings, ordinary buildings, background buildings that makes the street. And in the upper ones, you can see that in Helsinki, there are parts of the city, as I say, where the objective is to make a series of urban spaces with people living, you can see it on the right-hand side, people living in close association with very busy urban spaces. When we went looking for Alvaro Caesar's Braganza housing in Lisbon, we stomped up this road. It was a very steep hill, and we got sort of halfway up at the top, and one of the people that we were with turned around and said, "When are we going to reach this place, Julie?" Because it was quite steep and hot. And I looked up and I said, "Oh, we're there." And we were looking for this sort of famous architect's building, and suddenly we realized we were actually right next to it. And it was so ordinary. It was just it just fitted in with the landscape. And if you look at it, the buildings on the right, you have on the left, you have typical Lisbon buildings going up the street, and on the right is Alvaro Caesar's new housing block, and you can see that he's using the same height, the same kind of materials, similar kind of proportions of the windows, but you can see it's a contemporary building because the railings are slightly different and the windows are made slightly differently, and the projections of the balconies and so on are clearly in the modern idiom, but nevertheless it's of the same type as all the old buildings. So there's no show off at all. He's simply adding to the wall of buildings and the richness of that particular street going up the hill. And this is another example. Carlo Scarpa working in Verona, doing a bank, and you can imagine what a lot of the star architects would have this opportunity of a bank to do in a little old square. But Carlo Scarpa keeps the same type as the same palazzo type as the buildings around, similar kind of materials, but it's all interpreted in a slightly different way. So he adds to the richness of the place, and instead of messing it up. I always meant to write to the mayor of Verona and ask him why he allowed these cars to park in this square, because, yeah, you only get about 30 cars there anyway. So anyway, even Le Corbusier, the person who's sort of most vilified for inventing these buildings that stand alone, when he's asked to work in a street, keeps the same typology of the street, so that the wall of buildings of the street continues. Whereas Rem Koolhaas, in a project next to the in London, I've forgotten what it is now. Albert Hall, next to the Albert Hall in London. That's also just an infill building, and he could have politely gone there, but you can see there's a very different attitude that's made there, and I find that incredibly destructive, because he confuses, for a start, he confuses the background buildings with the foreground buildings. So your whole orientation gets confused, in my view. You get a conflict between what's already a foreground building with the old Albert Hall. Now you've got another one that's going to contest it and fight it. So stage one, or step one, is merely to contribute to the wall of buildings that make up one of those urban spaces. Step two is to make the whole wall. And on the bottom here, you can see a project in Amsterdam where there were very strict controls on architects, and you can see that it made a wall that's reasonably coherent as a piece of city defining a space. I think it could have been considerably improved, but nevertheless, it does do that. On the top is actually part of a little project of my own, which show in very low cost housing in Cape Town, the same kind of type with variations being used to make up a wall of a street. Step 3 is where you use the buildings to make a space. And again, this is more Alvaro Siza in Portugal. This is in Porto, with, again, very low-cost housing. It was a workers' housing project with a lot of participation by local people. And you can see that he used the typology of typical typology of the city, with these staircases going up, making contact with doorways, and the height of the buildings. And basically, he made a whole series of little squares. It was fairly rough and ready when we were there, and they were obviously, as you can see, they were obviously tidying it up a bit. But essentially, as a group of buildings, I think it adds to the spatial richness of the city rather than detracting from it. The upper levels you contacted with through stairs that went to a kind of little walkway that went around at second floor level. You can see it going around with bits of flowers and creepers going around at the second floor level. But basically a series of little squares. Another example is the I think you pronounce it something like Ersta project in Stockholm, which was from the 1950s, where you have a mixture of background and foreground buildings. They've painted the background buildings rather ferociously, which make them rather foreground, but you can see again that it's organized really as a whole series of squares that people can occupy in the way that we've been talking about. So if it comes now to looking at foreground buildings, what do you do? And again, I'm using Alvaro Siza, so you're getting a little glimpse of Alvaro Siza as we walk through. In this church of the Santa Maria in Marco, the town is called Marco de Canaveses, which is it's a small town in Portugal, quite close to Porto. And he does really what old churches have always done. On the crest of a hill, makes a big platform that's a place for all sorts of things to happen. So these are pictures of that place. It's well paved, and there are all sorts of events that would obviously take place there. From there you get views out over the city, and you can see that the building is made in a very contemporary way with these two sort of tower-like elements on each side of a very high main entrance. And when you've been in Portugal, even for just a little time, you find that you realize that he's actually working again with historical precedent. His building is not a completely abstract thing, but it relates both in the way that it's sited in the city and also in its form to old buildings old churches sitting on the crest of hills with these big towers and this big doorway in the middle of it. And then I think he's very clever with these very simple buildings, connecting the scales. So the scale of this tall church building, you can see how beautifully it connects down in a line down to the little two-story buildings on the left-hand side. And inside, it's a bit funny to go inside in a certain way, but you can also say that's part of the public space of the city. When you go inside, it's also got that scale of the city, so it's tall and very spacious, and you sort of feel those doorways. It's like belongs to the whole town, but then it's also very intimate. So along the left-hand side, there's a window right at your eye level that looks out over the city, and in the corner, top right here, you have a little baptistry, which is also very intimate. So it's got this mixture of big scale, small scale, the past in the sort of numinous spaces, and the present in the particular way that it's made. If we go to Merida, there's Jenny. There you are over there, Jenny. I see Jenny over there. There she is. Marie, there's a little town in Spain. It's actually a small town, but it's got the most Roman remains in Spain. And you can see it's got this very narrow building kind of scale about it. And there's a man called Raphael Moneo who designed a museum in it, Museum of Roman Antiquities. And I think it could very easily have been a big intrusion in that city, and I think he very cleverly made sure that it wasn't in a whole series of ways. And firstly, you can see he used this sort of rather narrow module of the building, which works with those rather narrow streets and narrow spaces that it sits in. And secondly, he relates it to the other buildings in the way that it makes a little urban square. And so if you look at the building from the other side, looking into that little urban square, you can see how it works and how in all sorts of ways it's a kind of contemporary version of an historical building. So he uses the arch form, and he uses windows and roofs and things like that show in a particular way that clearly connect with historical buildings, and yet you can see from the handling of them that it's a modern building. And more closely, he also used the Roman brick, the old Roman brick. So it's a little 50 millimeter, 2-inch brick right through, and they're very broad. That gives a particular quality to the building as a whole. So in many ways, he's connecting with the place that the building is in. And when you go inside it, the building is placed at over the top of a lot of old Roman remains, but at a different angle, so you never muddle what's new and what's old, and no time ever in the future would you be able to muddle that. And when you go in, you go right in underneath the building, and you have this firstly a wonderful feeling of the antiquity of the place, and you also are enabled to see the old buildings. The main space inside, again, is an interpretation of an old space. It's got a feeling of the old vaulted, domed space of Roman antiquity, and yet it's made in a way with roof lights and things that are quite clearly contemporary. And this gives you some idea of those details. So there's a mixture of this Roman bricks and then this sort of very contemporary metal detailing of the walkways that thread through it. Now, if you come to a town hall in a little place called Murcia, which is getting quite close to Barcelona, what do you do if you're asked to build a town hall in a square like this? And this, by the way, faces a cathedral on the other side. And I think that you couldn't really do much better, I don't think, than Moneo did. You make a wall kind of building that keeps the continuity of the square. You use similar kind of materials in the building to the others. Of course, it's not as weathered as they are now. There's stone will weather and darken in time. The proportions that are used in the building are rather similar to the windows and so on around it. The whole scale of the building and the feeling of visual intensity in it is rather similar to the old Baroque buildings that are around it. And here you can see, if you look at the windows in the new building and on the old ones on the left, you can see how easily it makes a connection with them. And then it has these beautiful corners that make not only corners of the building, but also corners of the square that you move around. The one with the sort of cascading thing on the left, and on the right-hand side with the soft curve that takes you around the corner. And it's interesting what it does, because he didn't put the entrance of this building into the square where it would contest the entrance to the cathedral. He put it round the corner there. So it doesn't fight with the cathedral opposite, but it's still at the end of a street, and it's made in an appropriately bold way. Internally, it's tiny. It's a very little building, actually, which you wouldn't think from the outside. It's tiny, but again, he uses color and materials in a way that evokes the quality of those old Baroque buildings, and yet they're clearly contemporary modern. And right through the building, it's referring outwards to the beautiful square outside, until you come up to the top and look through that that sort of front that it has, and look down over the square. Now, I don't think you can do any of those things if you're building cities like this. And I think it would be a fair question to ask, because I've shown you already quite small buildings. I think it would be a reasonable question for you to ask as well, what about the really big buildings and the big developments and those sort of things that are going on? You know, because it's easy to deal with these little town halls here or there, but what about these big things? And I'm not sure that I can answer that adequately, but in many ways, you can't make decent spaces, urban spaces with big buildings in the same kind of a way. And secondly, do you really need these huge big buildings? If you look at the one on the right, for instance, there's this 50-story block of houses in amongst 2 stories. If you just made the area all out of 6 stories, you'd get the same number of people going, and so you could make a set of squares that would work around a set of squares in the ways that we've been looking at. Whereas you can just never do it with these huge big buildings. They will always be inhumane spaces. And these two, I mean, this is Moscow and Granada again. I mean, if you look at the space around, there's lots of space around. You could easily squash those things down and make decent urban spaces out of them, instead of these silly jokes, if you like, that stand there that may be amusing when they go up, and it would be fine if it was for a pop concert that lasted for a week or something like that. But as buildings just stand there for centuries, it's really, I think, extremely destructive. And so we come back to the square in London. I mean, this group of buildings in London. It would be very easy to just get that all down to 4 to 6 story and house the same number of people in that area around decent squares. So there's a real problem. And I must finish off now. In many ways, I think we've got to decide what we want. If we want humane cities that you can live in, that sustain the good life, that enable all the sort of things that those places like Padua and so on and old Barcelona did, then we've got to decide all kind of things, and we've got to make lots of decisions about how we make the city. And if we don't want that, then we're going to end up just like the chaos that there is in these cities that are going up all over the world. And I think that there's really a very simple a decision that's got to be made between the two. If we go for the first, we must recognize, and I'm sort of showing a picture that I could have shown last night too, because somebody asked a question about that these old cities formed themselves slowly in little pieces. And I said, yeah, but there were also very powerful decisions that are made. And I mean, here are 3. Here is Nash's scheme for London, of Regent's Park, Regent Circus, down Regent Street, past Piccadilly and Oxford circuses, down to Trafalgar Square, down to the Mall and along the Mall to Buckingham Palace. It was a very, very powerful design decision that was made, and then all those other things around it can happen in all sorts of different ways. And you can say the same for Paris, and you can say the same for Rome. Very powerful decisions were made at a certain time by one or other group of people, normally for all the wrong reasons, because it was for power of some one kind or another. And even Nash's scheme, he himself said that he did it like that so he could divide the poor, dirty working classes from the upper crust. So often done for the wrong reasons, but they nevertheless made very firm things around which all sorts of smaller, more humane things could happen. Okay, so I'll leave it there for today. Thank you. There's 5 minutes for questions, if there are any questions. Or Yes, it was.
I understand the point you're getting at about the lower buildings.
Hmm.
But I looked at some of the examples you showed, and to me they are as brutal as anything you could find. Blank walls, buildings, even lower buildings, blank walls, however nice they might be inside, in the end become hard and uninteresting on the outside.
Oh.